But you hit on it. That is one of the most important questions that people should start to ask themselves, and that is, what is it that you want?
Yeah, it seems like there is an automatic process of you looking for something, but you're not quite sure what you're looking for, and then you stop and ask, and simply this feeling actually dissolves.
Well, it does, but what was there was a feeling of dissatisfaction. Now, that feeling of dissatisfaction, in fact, can grow to the point there's a continuum. Some people are really, really driven by that feeling. Okay, here's an example: is that uh, a very tense situation happens that builds up between two people to the point that either one or both of them become very physically agitated, and you can see that agitation in the sense of leg movements, that they'll begin to wiggle their legs, or and basically what this is that this is a lot of body chemistry going on because the situation is really tense. The body is ready for anything in the sense of fight or flight. But
Okay.
what happens with all of those chemicals is our ability to think is greatly diminished. In other words, the human part of the mind is no longer in control because the body has gone into survival mode.
The reptilian brain, right?
The reptilian brain now, and not only is the reptilian brain in charge, but it is flooding the body with signals, and through the pituitary and the pineal gland, giving information to the adrenal gland to pull a whole lot of crap out of the kidneys and put it into the bloodstream because we're going to recycle that stuff. And the names of those things are, there's a lot of them actually, but two of them are really well identified because we know all about them. That's cortisol and adrenaline. That's why
Yeah,
they
yeah.
call it the adrenal gland, is because it pumps out this chemical in the blood called adrenaline. Well, that blood with adrenaline in it then um, actually goes right into the muscles. And so all of that shaking that's going on, agitation that you can see in somebody's body, um, is there automatically. It's not thought out. I'm going to become agitated physically. That it's because of the body chemistry. In fact, I just thought of this, and I haven't thought of it for many, many years. But I saw this in a movie, but I knew that it had been true. In other words, the movie makers or the writers didn't just make this up, but this is something that actually used to happen within the American Indian system, that they had a truth telling machine, or let us say a lie detector.
Okay.
And that the lie detectors that we have nowadays have, they put a thing around the band so that they can watch your breathing. Then they put galvanomic things to go for skin resistance and other things like that, so that if someone starts to sweat. But in the American Indian tradition, what they would merely do is take a bowl of water, very low tech, and then have the person who is under investigation to put his index finger, into the water, only about an inch deep or so. And if he becomes agitated, his finger will start to vibrate that water, and it can be easily seen. So even though the investigators don't see the agitation in the person, they can see that agitation being vibrated right into the water, causing waves.
Wow.
All right. And so let's look at that for a moment, because what springs that off is feeling. By the time it gets to that level of agitation, that would be an emotion.
Okay.
And the emotion that you could see with that would be an emotion that has to do with fear, and fear is related to confusion. In other words, if something happens and you know what it happens, you'll have an adverse reaction to it or a positive action to it. You either like it or you don't. But if you don't know something, if something happens and you're not sure of what to do, or you're not sure of what's happening, for instance, getting caught in a lie generally causes great confusion in someone.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so they don't know what to do and they become confused. This is a kind of feeling that the Buddha talks about that's an actual, real, ordinary feeling, but it doesn't happen quite as often as liking and not liking. But when it does come up, it really comes up.
Yeah, it's visible.
It's visible. You can see it in fact. One of the qualities of a good actor will be that he knows how to manipulate his body the way that someone would behave autonomically or unconsciously to become very agitated. An example of that would be in the situation of just before he's going to pull out his gun and shoot somebody, he'll get visibly agitated,
Yeah.
what they call nervous. So this feeling, a lot of people think when it's in the sutras that it says neither a pleasant nor an unpleasant feeling. They don't understand that, and so they translate it wrongly as a neutral feeling. Well,
Okay.
guess what? A neutral feeling is is no feeling at all. It's completely neutral. This feeling that we're talking about, that's a feeling that's not positive and not negative, is really strong sometimes. Can be extraordinarily strong. So these are the three feelings of I like it and I don't like it, and I'm not sure about whether I like it or not. I'm confused.
So, just to take
Go
a quick question, when you say I like it, it precedes to I want it, and therefore
for
I gotta have it. But when you're like
yes.
confused, what does that lead to?
If it's wise, it leads to curiosity.
If it's unwise,
In it's unwise, and it leads to agitation and fear and doubt, worry,
but
anxiety.
this doesn't like tend to the same way as the negative feeling.
In fact, it almost always is. At one time, I kind of thought that there was only two kinds of bad feelings and one kind of good feeling. Now I recognize for sure that these kind of feelings that are unwise are all three bad, in the sense that they all three lead to dukkha. But if our feelings are wise, then we can control them. And here's an example of that. If you like something and you know that you like it, and you can leave it at just liking without going into wanting.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
was
Or
uh,
go ahead.
I was reading today Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's book. I think it's open right here. 22. Uh, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, Buddha Dhamma for Inquiring Minds. And he was talking about how even like the act of singing or dancing is compared to the act of weeping because they all lead to dukkha in a sense.
Are wanting.
Yeah, yeah, wanting,
And that
not
wanting
liking.
then, yes, uh-huh.
And it got me confused because at first thought I was like, if something is positive and since it actually is leading to a good thing, then I don't see how this creates dukkha in a sense.
It might not. It depends upon if it's wise or not.
Okay.
You can almost go to the point of talking about major key and minor key, and that a lot of music evokes um, feelings of sadness,
Yeah.
longing. Almost all popular music in today is, let us say, well, the terms that I have may be old, but acid rock, hard rock, uh, rap, gangster rap, um, longing, um, lyrics like I can't get no satisfaction. They're trying to turn it happy, but the basis of it is sadness. It's a longing. It's wanting something.
And the fact that they are famous just basically shows how much people like identify the feeling of
Exactly. It's
dukkha.
very common. Everybody can see that it takes a lot of wisdom to understand that much of the goal has to do with the quality of a few words, the real power that you'll get from the Dhamma. One of the most important words would be satisfaction. All right. Satisfaction would be the kind of feeling that people have. Let us say they've been on the dance floor and they've been doing their dancing, wild gyrations or tango or whatever it is. But after the dance is over, when they sit down, that's when they can actually relax. So long as they're dancing, they're actually in a state of agitation.
Yeah. But like comparing it to weeping was such a dramatic comparison.
Actually, I use Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's style myself in the sense of he would be a shocker. He would shock people
Yeah.
with the truth.
Yeah.
And
It's it seems like almost like unreasonable because uh, since he was talking that way, it seems like you don't actually need anything and you could like go live a monastic life of some sort and be completely happy with it. So, in that sense, I
that's
agree
the
with
entire
him.
point of going to live in a monastic life. Though many people don't actually get that happiness, quite a few do.
Yeah. But in a
But
sense, like, I'm not going to leave my layman's life, right? So,
well, you don't have to be happy.
yeah, it was like, yeah, if I feel like dancing, I'll dance and it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay that you dance if you do it wisely.
Yeah.
Here's a very very clear analogy to that. There is a sutta, and the sutta is in the 80s, and it's a story about King Pasenadi and the queen. I forget her name, Melinda or something, was having a conversation about this. And here's the story: that someone passing by close to the Buddha, where he was telling people, his students, this quality, that guy didn't like what the Buddha said. So he went off and eventually he got himself into a gambling den or a crap game, a game of bones or whatever. And while he was in that game of bones, he was telling the people there about what the Buddha said, and everybody disagreed with what the Buddha had said. Well, it just so happens that a woman overheard what they were saying, and she worked actually for the queen. She was an attendant to the queen, and so she went back to the royal place, the palace or whatever, and spread this news around within the group there, and so it got to the queen. And so the queen told the king this thing, and the king didn't like it at all. And neither did the queen. And so they went back to this girl and said, "Will you please go to the Buddha?" Eventually, what happened was is this woman kept going back to the Buddha to get the teaching so that she could go and take them back to the royal palace and tell the royal family. And in the process of doing this errand, that she was given that she actually became noble. She became a sotapan. And so here I've been telling you all of this story, and I haven't even told you what the Buddha said. And the name of the sutta is what the Buddha said. Grief comes from those who are dear. Now think about that for a second. Because most people will say, oh no, oh, my family is so important. All right. But the Buddha is not talking about it at a little level. Oh, I like my son today and I like the thought of my son. But in fact, I'm going to have a lot of grief from my son when he disagrees with me, when I give him an order and he doesn't follow that, or that he rebels. And within Western culture, almost every son rebels from their father. The whole culture in the West is set up for young men, especially, to have authority issues.
Yeah.
And guess what? That's grief. Grief comes to those who are dear.
It's almost like an expectation, right?
Well, it's a setup. And the
Yeah.
cause and effect, once the setup is there, then eventually the all the pieces that are needed for the sufficiency, because the necessary ingredients are there, so it happens that that grief will occur. Another one is if you marry someone and you love them very much, that relationship is going to break up someday, and there will break up. There will be grief.
Yeah.
All right. If the wife dies, there's grief. If she divorces you, there's grief. If she just disappears, there's grief. If you want away from her, that's grief, whether you leave or not.
Yeah.
All right. So, in all cases, everything is temporary. And if that whatever we have is dear to us, then when it changes, because of the temporary nature of it, it may fade away, it may cease. But we're going to have to relinquish everything. In fact, I
Yeah.
just went through the sequence of step 13, 14, 15, and 16 of Anapanasati
Wow.
in quick succession because they're related that way. It's not like that you're going to spend 3 years on step 13 and then 3 years on step 14. Oh, no. 13, 14, 15, and 16, there they are. All right. Things change. And when they change, they die. And in the process of dying, there's a fading away process. That things don't just instant. Well, sometimes it looks instant, like the nuclear bomb goes off and then all of a sudden instantly, but there was still a bit of a process. But generally, most things have a long fading away process time. Like the relationship goes sour or the wife gets sick or things like this, so that we've got good warnings for these things. But those warnings, if they're ignorant, they're also sources of grief. And in all cases, things are going to change and die. And the question is, how well are we adept at relinquishing our attachment to them so that eventually we don't attach to very much? And the attachments that we have are more tenuous.
Yeah.
Okay, so with wisdom, even though you have that you're married and have a long relationship, there will be signs coming for that relationship to be over, and a wise man will plan accordingly, not in the sense of making plans to do things, but making plans about how he's going to feel about it, so that he can maintain whatever level of grief that is satisfying for him.
Yeah.
All right, well, now let's take that back to almost everything you do, because
Yeah.
everything you do has to do with the quality of how dear is it to you.
Yeah.
And when you have very few things that are dear to you, then there is very little cause for grief from those things. So now back to those three kinds of feelings. I like it. And if I can stay wise at that point, the liking is merely the liking, or the disliking is merely the disliking, because we have a wisdom at that point when those feelings arise.
It's almost
This
like
is
I'm sorry. It's almost like the body has a mind of itself, and the cognition has another part, and so each of them have like a time of processing things. And so if you can use the cognition mind to simply notice everything that is happening in the feeling, then you can like foresee what is going to happen and basically like prepare for it in a sense.
that's wisdom.
Yeah.
All right. What I would say that a major component of wisdom has to do with trajectory. Now that's a technical scientific term, but it can be applied to everything. In other words, you can see the arrow's trajectory. If that arrow is coming right towards you, and you're quick and you can see it in time, you can stand out of the way.
Yeah.
If it's a spear, normally spears are very slow. And not only that, but somebody has to make a huge amount of action to throw the spear that can be seen. And so I do not understand why anybody would ever get hit with a spear, because they're just so easy to see coming, and you just stand out of the way because they're really slow in the air.
I was talking recently with my girlfriend about this, and she proposed a question about if this way of looking at things aren't like almost like a emotional bypass or some sort, like if this can't hurt you in on the long run. And I didn't have like a specific answer to that.
Well, the problem with the question of bypass means that the energy is already there and you divert it.
Almost like negating.
All right, or trying to turn it off. All right. What we're
uh,
working with here is to learn to see things sooner and sooner and sooner so that we can take control over it sooner, down to the second level, or even the microsecond level, so
yeah.
that we all right. So basically what that means is that we're beginning to take control rather than letting things happen on their own. And part of that taking control, surprisingly enough, winds up in a whole lot of non doing. So it seems kind of strange. All right.
Yeah.
So the example is the car won't start. I know that cars should be in a situation so that they start when someone wants to start the car. And that there was a time when the car didn't start because they needed to move it, because the monkeys had come to collect the coconuts. And I thought about it, but I didn't make any plans. I just left it. When Tam comes home, I mention it to her, but I don't say any more than that. The next morning, I hear while I'm sitting on the porch the car getting started.
You didn't
So
have
there
to
was,
do anything.
didn't have to do anything at all because other people wanted that car to start more than
Yeah.
I did.
It's almost like you create the problem. If you don't create it, then it doesn't exist.
Precisely so. That's what we're getting at is that almost all problems are mentally created.
It's the weird thing is that we're so conditioned on a social level to basically take everything as a problem that whenever you start to not doing that, it's it's weird.
All right. So that means that in some cases that singing and dancing is kind of relief for the stress. They feel like dancing because if the body has already got all of that, let us say, stored up energy in the form of leaky adrenaline, or that people get agitated, and dancing is one of the ways of working that off. Now, one of the qualities of dancing and singing and exercise or doing sports or even walking,
Breathing.
those things that is breathing, precisely.
I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, I want you to get it like that. Right on. That's where it really is. It's all about the breathing.
Yeah.
And so if we can learn how to properly breathe, then we can rid the body of those chemicals that leak up because of habit, while at the same time, by eliminating that stuff, we're putting the mind in a different frame of reference. And one of the most important things to do with the Dhamma is to change the mind's frame of reference. All right. And the frame of reference that most people are in is an ordinary frame of reference. That means that there are authority figures, there are rules, there are regulations. You will be told what to do, and you will do them, and you won't like doing it, but you'll do it anyway, and occasionally rebel, either just mentally or actually physically. All right. So that's the way that we normally do it. That's our normal frame of reference. Several words that can be used for that would be loser, victim,
Yeah.
or bottom dog in the top dog, bottom dog situation. Who's in charge here? And almost everybody feels that whatever it is, I'm not in control. An example of the car not starting was that meant now the truck or the car is in control of my life. It's given me work to do. I must get that battery charged or replaced or whatever. So now the truck becomes the boss. This is the way that we live our whole lives, is that we see something that needs to be done, and it's almost like an order for you to take action. This is because of the structure of the way that our society works. And it is it's a patriarchal society or a hierarchical society, which means that the real power is maintained in the hands of the few, and that they cling to that power because not having power gives them a feeling of insecurity. Well, their feelings of insecurity are going to be really strong. The more you have to protect, the more you will feel that you've got to act to protect that stuff, because the more you have, the more dangerous it is. An example of that is just going to the other side of the house. You can go to the other side of the house and carry 2 or 3 things in your hands. But if you carry 15 things in your hands, the likelihood is you're going to drop something.
Yeah.
But the one way to guarantee that you can make it to the other side of the house without ever dropping anything is by going empty handed in the first place. Because even if you take just one thing, you can drop it. And you can see people doing that. They're holding the keys in the hands and then bang, they're on the floor. They're
Yeah.
holding their cell phone in their hand and then bang, it's on the floor. The more things that you have in your hands, then the more likely you are to drop something. Now, if you think about that on an instantaneous level, you can also see that as the accumulation of wealth. Means now, instead of all of that wealth making me secure, now I've got a job to do to secure that wealth. And so I've got even more work to do.
And more
There's a
responsibility.
Right. There's a story about I think the name of it is The Prince and the Pauper. And the story is that a young boy who was a pauper was very, very streetwise. And it somehow was discovered that he was the long lost prince. And so they took him to the palace and they gave him all kinds of princely stuff to do, including having an armed guard and whatever like that. And he could see right through the charade of the royal palace. He knew that everything was a fraud and he didn't like it at all. And so he escaped. And he went back to being the street bum. The urchin was a better life, but very few people ever have that opportunity to. They if they're raised in royalty, then it's really hard to get out of it. That's exactly the situation that Siddhartha Gautama, the Sakyan, found himself in. Is that this royal life that I have is not satisfying, and so he left. But there was a lot of politics going on that led to that dissatisfaction. It's not the same as him. You see, the story is that he was cloistered in the palace. His father was worried, and so he kept him in the palace. And then the Siddhartha snuck out and found an old, a sick, a dead body, and a monk. And that's the story. That's all made up. That's not true at all. That in fact, that story was a story that the Buddha told Ananda about something that happened way deep in the past.
Okay.
That the real story is that the according to some scientific research by and written up by Ambedkar, who was the one who was very famous in India and started and reestablished Buddhism in India. So we're talking about, and he was a college professor, a history scholar, I think, before that. And so his story is that the Buddha left the palace under duress because of a flood. The course of the water of the river had changed. And that caused a dispute about who owns the land between where the course of the water used to be and where it is now. Because oftentimes tribes will have the boundary of the water itself. And so if the water moves, then you're going to have conflict. Again, grief comes to those things that are dear. And so both sides are about to go to war, and Siddhartha at that age was adamant that the Sakyans were not going to go to war, even though they were all voting for it. And so because they wanted it and he was dead set against it, he recognized that the possibility of him being the royal leader of this tribe not going to happen. But when he did leave the palace, his parents knew, they gave him send off, and he took a group of people with him, even a horse
A
and the
white
groom.
horse.
Exactly. So if he snuck out of the palace at night, why would he take the groom and all of that? You see, so that whole magical story doesn't fit the facts. But the point is, getting back to that issue about Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, because I don't want to let that go, is
Okay.
is that the Dhamma sometimes needs to be taught in a way that really impresses people, that you really have to get it. The other way is to do the same thing over and over and over and over again. That's why it's good to do retreats or for students to call so that we can talk about the Dhamma, so that every time that we talk, it gets a little bit deeper in, so it begins to seep deep. In other words, one rainstorm does not a year's worth of moisture for the crops make. Has to rain often. And the more rain you get, the more that the ground will soak it up. So this is a way of looking at the Dhamma. Because the natural tendency is for the mind to go back to the way that it was.
Yeah.
And so there's a big wake-up call. And Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was doing that. He got into some, let us call it trouble. He got into some trouble in the 1930s by telling the truth in an open forum that had before that been kept private or secret. that, in fact, what I'm talking about is that there are two Buddhisms. Or let us say that there is Buddhism, and then deeply buried inside of Buddhism is the actual teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah, you talked about this the other day. There is a sort of religion part of it, which has
Hmm.
imbued the culture, and there are the teachings, which are religionless in a sense.
And cultureless also.
Yeah.
That we begin to understand that we want to renounce the culture, because the culture now, Freud and Byrne and a lot of psychologists see this same thing. Those who study the mind are able to see this. Now, Freud had the quality, or let us say the concept that you've heard about ego states, in the sense of the superego, the ego, and the id. Well, that fits just perfectly right in there with the teaching of the Buddha. It also fits quite perfectly right into the way that the neuroscientists are figuring out the way that the mind works. And it also, because he was a student of Freud, Eric Byrne put an easier to understand face on it. One of the examples is when the word ego, egotistical, all of those kind of words is actually a mistake. That they should have. Oh, he's being id-atistical rather than ego-atistical. That in fact the ego, in Freudian's sense, is the adult uh, ego state in Burns, so that he has a parent and a child and an adult. And basically, what's happening is within the human mind that all of the rites, rules, rituals, ways to do things are stored in this thing that was calling the parent ego state. And the Buddha would refer to that as the vocal sankhara, or the verbal sankhara. In other words, the stories we tell ourselves about what needs to be done and how are things and what is the right way to do it. In other words, most of our concepts. And then there's a dialogue going on inside the human brain that basically is like this: the parent ego state is saying you need to do this and you need to do that, and the child is saying I want to play, I don't want to go to work. All right, and so that's the basic conversation within the human mind, and that keeps us in that state of suffering, of going back and forth between what shoulda, oughta, would have been done, and the fact that we really don't want to do any of that stuff.
Hmm.
But there's a third part of the human mind, and that what in neurolinguistics or and also in neuroscience you would think of as that's the frontal cortex. That's what makes humans human. And that a lot of our concepts are done that way. In other words, you could say that this business about how things that should be done is not totally instinctual, but it's learned. But that is always spoken or verbal in the sense of do what I tell you to do. Don't look at what I'm doing.
Hmm.
All right. Don't do as I say, or do as I say, not as I do. You've heard that many times.
Yeah.
Ah, well, that's the authority. That's that dialogue. That's the super ego talking. And what it does do is it leads to hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And I use the term church lady. In other words, I make up the rules for you.
Church lady, that's deep, man.
Yeah, it comes from Saturday Night Live. So that church lady in our mind is that part that gives us all of this work to do, and the child ego state is then saying no to it. And what the Buddha is talking about and what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is talking about is wake up. Let that frontal cortex, let the most human part of your brain take over and be in charge. And one of the things that he's going to do while he's in charge, he's going to pat the child on the head and say, there now, you can have your fun, you can enjoy your life. And for the superego, we basically say, shut up already.
Yeah.
That all of those things that we think about is, and when we're lost in thought, is almost always the concoction of um, that super ego, or the parent ego state, that is talking about what needs to be done, what is this, what is that. And basically what the child is doing, the child is not talking, the child is feeling, and the way that we feel is unsatisfactory. We don't like that all of this work is needing to be done. Well, if while we're sitting in meditation and we recognize that the mind has just wandered away into its old stuff, and that it's not very pleasant, and also we go into kind of a shutdown mode because it's not pleasant, we go into survival mode and we stop breathing.
Yeah.
And so this is where anapanasati comes in. And so basically, here's the really important point. If you can learn to remember to work with your breath and learn to control the breath, then you can learn to control your thoughts, and you can also eventually learn to control your feelings. But if you can't control the breath, then you don't have much choice over the thoughts and the feelings. They're just going to run the way that they normally do, and it's really hard. But if we can start to practice, that's why anapanasati is so valuable. But the Buddhist religion would say, oh, don't try to control the breath, just watch it, that the whole point is mindfulness. But oh no, everything is about learning how to take control over the automatic stuff, to learn to breathe so that you're getting adequate air, because the frontal cortex needs more oxygen. And if you can learn to control the breath, then with that, you can get yourself into a state of nice satisfaction.
From
That's
what
why,
I've,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, from what I've read, specifically from some traditions, they talk about not controlling your breath because that impedes you to get into the first, second, and third jhanas, I guess. I don't know if that makes any sense because.
No, it doesn't. And I know the source of that stuff. And I also recognize that it's much more common in Sri Lanka, a little bit less in Burma, but that the Visuddhimagga is not well regarded so much in Thailand.
Okay.
That's literature at about the 5th century A.D. That the way that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa looks at it, and many other people in Thailand, in fact, there's even a group called the Santi Asok, which actually means anti-Asok, which means before the time of Asok. Let's get back to what actually happened with the teachings of the Buddha, rather than bringing in later works and later translations and later literature, etc., like that. All right, and let's leave it. In fact, if you cannot, how to say it, one of the keys is step 5 of Anapanasati. And when I say steps now, we're talking about, if we can, dance steps, not marching steps. It's not something, step 5, that you do after you've done step 1, 2, and 3, and 4, but rather it's not in chronological order, but rather we can look at it in the sense of first jhana means you have to collect together some factors. The factors of first jhana that need to be collected together, the number one and first one of all, is to have the mind removed from hindrances. In other words, getting out of the past, getting out of the future, or getting out of the superego, getting out of our ought, shoulds, and wants. and be here in this present moment. And the way that we do that is with sati, to remember. All right, to remember that we're going to do something new. And so one of the things that we're going to remember is that how long can we watch the breath? The answer to that is that so long as you're controlling it, you can watch it. But if you stop thinking about the breath and stop controlling it, it will go back to its ordinary way, and then the mind will go back into its ordinary state.
Yeah.
But if we practice this over and over and over and over again, then we build up the skill, especially the skill of sati, to remember, I'm going to breathe. Now, with that breathing comes the quality that is known in Pali, the step 5 is piti. And that piti word in Pali does not translate to anything that I know of in English. So we have to,
Rapture.
well, what is rapture?
I have no clue.
All right. So if the translation doesn't mean anything, it may not be a very useful word to translate into. All right.
Yeah.
A much better way of looking at it is how normally people are looking to feel really good. That's why they go to the football game. That's why sometimes they get into business, is they want to win. All right. So winning is now getting fairly close to this quality of piti. One of the qualities of winning, especially with sports and competition and whatever, is there's some breathing going on. So we have this quality that if you start to take some deep breaths and getting some oxygen, you begin also to change your attitude out of the attitude of being a loser into the attitude of being a winner, with perhaps the thought, I can do this meditation. I can come out of my suffering. I can enjoy a moment of joy. And so we begin to change our attitude from the attitude of the child that's being repressed by all of the rites, rules, rituals, stories, and concepts into living in the present moment that feels really good because we feel successful.
Yeah.
And so the first knowledge on the noble path, the very, very first step of Sotapan, is expressed like this: that no matter how obstructed the mind is, in other words, recurring hindrances or a big issue that we've got on our mind, but no matter how much we are hindered, we do know that we have the skill to come out of it and come to this present moment, to see the truth of the moment is that right now there's no reason to suffer. Yeah, grandma just died. The body's laying there in the other room. But I don't have to think about it. I can think about nothing at all, in fact. I could just be happy that we don't,
Yeah.
because, I mean, how much is your grief and how much of your despair and how much of your futzing around is going to bring her back to life?
Yeah. Good point.
Good point. Right. So whatever you do is not going to help the fact that you've lost your granny, but not thinking about her is more pleasant than dwelling on the suffering that we're giving ourselves by thinking about her.
Yeah.
So getting away from it all. That's the way of looking at it. That's what a vacation is supposed to be in the West, but now that's turned into materialism, so that when people get away from it all, by the time that they've traveled, booked, uh, uh, been on site of the resort, paid all the fees, done all the activities that the resort allow, with all of their sports and everything, by the time the vacation is over, people come back to work with the idea of what a relief it is. Now my work is a vacation from the vacation I just had.
True. It almost feels as good to come back, right?
So if we can have a real vacation, then the real vacation is actually vacating. Think of the word vacation as actually emptiness. That's the same word as sunyata. When we think of that, and the philosophers, and they talk about it in physics terms and say we don't understand the teaching of the Buddha on sunyata, then don't use that word emptiness. Use the word vacation.
Yeah, that's useful.
And this is the way that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa taught. He taught in a way that really woke people up.
Yeah.
And so this is the way that the Dhamma should be taught. Now, part of the way that the society works is around don't make waves. Go along to get along. Do what you're told to do because you don't want the ramifications. When this goes really, really off base, I mean, really, really down a rabbit hole, it's called political correctness.
Yeah.
All right, where the truth is no longer important, that getting along is more important. Don't ruffle other people's feathers because they're standing there just ready for you to ruffle them. All right, but if you have the truth, then the truth is not politically correct. And the Dhamma and the Buddha are all about truth, not about being politically correct, not going along to get along, not following the rules. It's more about truth. And so the religion is all about go along to get along. In other words, you go along with what the Christian church, and then because you go along, then you'll get along into heaven. That's their
Yeah.
story. But most of the Christians wind up being unhappy. There's very rare that you're going to find a completely happy Christian that's actually free from sin. They say, take Jesus as your Savior, and you shall be not forgiven of your sins, but free from sin. And yet those ceremonies, even if you do the big one, and the big one is you take a bath with your clothes on in muddy water, and then you vote for Donald Trump. And thou shalt be saved.
Yeah.
But that's the southern U.S. version of Christianity. But the point is that salvation is phony. But if someone could take that ceremony, could take that baptism and say, right, I am going to be absolutely determined that I'm not going to be sinful again. I'm going to be free from sin. Then he might be able to pull it off, especially if he keeps remembering. Perhaps he tattoos a cross or a picture of Jesus on his hand, so every time he looks at his hands, he can see Jesus, and then he remembers, oh, I'm going to be sin-free. But it normally doesn't work like that. It needs to be repeated over and over and over again, and sometimes we need a little bit of shock therapy. And basically, what that shock therapy is to tell the people the truth.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a couple of examples of that. You have heard Jesus say, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But there's a third line that's not well remembered, and that is, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, but first it'll piss you off.
That's a good one.
And another version of that same thing is coming out of that movie, A Few Good Men, where, let's see, who was it? Jack Nicholson played the part of Colonel Jessup when he's on the stands and says, the truth! You can't handle the truth. Well, guess what? He's right. Most people can't handle the truth.
Yeah.
The truth is, he had to do some pretty dirty stuff as the colonel of Guantanamo Bay in order to keep the place active, because otherwise, if he's not going to do it with an iron fist, he's going to lose control of the place. That's the truth, okay? But it got him into a lot of trouble when he said it on the stand. But that's the whole point. The truth, we can't handle the truth, and so we become politically correct anyway. So part of the Dhamma is that we become devoted to the truth. And in fact, this first step that I mentioned to you, that no matter how obscured or obstructed the mind is, that we can clean it out and come back to see the truth, can see the actual moment. For instance, if we're filled with fear about, oh, if I don't do this, that, or the other thing, something bad will happen, and then you wake up and say, wait a minute, nothing bad's happening right now. Let's enjoy this moment. Nothing bad is happening. The only thing that's bad happening is I'm thinking to myself something bad is happening. But the reality of the moment is nothing bad is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Damarato, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think I have to go. I have to wake up early tomorrow.
All right, we'll call more often because we need to cover this stuff more and more often.
Will do. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
Have a good one.
Keep remembering to breathe.
Always.
Remember to be joyful. Remember that it's your job to be a winner, not a loser.
Yeah, the lion.
The lion, right, to become the emperor of your own pile of dirt, as opposed to being buried under it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
practice
bye-bye.
well.
Thank you so
Practice
much.
well.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.